The seventh morning breaks over the plains of Gilgal. The air is thick with the copper scent of blood and the heavy black smoke of a burnt offering. A king stands beside a stone altar, his hands stained from the slaughter, watching the eastern horizon. Behind him, the camp is bleeding men. His soldiers are scattering into the ravines, burying themselves in thickets, vanishing into the limestone caves. The army of Israel is dissolving into the earth. He was told to wait 7 days. The sun has risen on the seventh day. The deadline has expired. The man who gave the order has not appeared. Listen to 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 8 in the King James Version. And he tarried 7 days, according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. Picture it, a monarch watching his kingdom evaporate. Just across the jagged terrain at Michmash, a massive, heavily armed Philistine strike force is assembling. 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, foot soldiers like the sand on the seashore. Every hour the king waits. He loses another 100 swords to pure terror. The pressure is suffocating. The silence from the prophet is deafening. So Saul takes the ashes into his own hands. He calls for the burnt offering. He initiates the ritual to seek the favor of heaven before the absolute slaughter begins. And for this single act, a desperate, terrifying prayer by a king backed against a wall, he is permanently, unforgivingly stripped of his royal bloodline. The crown is torn from his family forever. The prophet arrives just as the smoke hits the sky and delivers a fatal, irreversible sentence. Sit with that. The punishment feels wildly disproportionate to the crime. Why does a delayed prophet and a hurried sacrifice cost the first king of Israel his entire dynasty? The answer is not just in the ashes. It is buried in a ghost timeline. There is an anomaly in the text, a mathematical gap so strange that modern English Bibles fundamentally disagree on how to translate the very first verse of this chapter. To find out what actually broke that morning at Gilgal, we have to look at the oldest surviving fragments of the Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, sealed in jars in the caves of Qumran 2,000 years ago. Specifically, a fragmented manuscript known as 4Q51. It holds a piece of Samuel that shatters our modern reading of the timeline. Watch what the text does. The English King James says in verse 1, Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel. It implies this crisis happens almost immediately after his coronation. The young king takes the throne, the enemy gathers, the test arrives. That is how the English reads. But the ancient scroll from Qumran reveals a hollow space right in the middle of that chronological record. A missing number in the Hebrew that changes the entire nature of the countdown. The smoke from the altar at Gilgal is still rising. The king turns from the butchered animal to finally see the old prophet cresting the hill. Perfectly, devastatingly late. But the clock that ran out that morning was not wound the week before. The ashes are still hot, but the timeline holding them has suddenly fractured. The ancient scroll in the cave forces us to look backward at the reign of the king. How many years actually passed before the seventh day arrived? The Judean desert holds its secrets in the dark. Deep inside the limestone caves of Qumran, undisturbed for 2 millennia, a shattered piece of parchment rested in the dust. When scholars unrolled the fragments known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a ghost in the timeline of Israel's first king. Return to the King James Version, 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. The English reads smoothly, almost like a passing historical note. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, read that again. The English translators give us a king in his infancy, a man who has barely warmed the throne. If this crisis at Gilgal happens in year 2 of his reign, Saul is a rookie monarch making a rookie mistake under pressure. But step behind the English translation. Look at the ancient Masoretic Hebrew text it was built from, and compare it to the shattered fragments pulled from the Qumran caves. There is a literal hole in the biblical timeline. In the raw Hebrew, the verse reads, "Saul was a son of a year in his reigning, and he reigned 2 years over Israel." That translates to a king who was 1 year old when he took the throne, and who died at age 3. The math is broken. A number dropped out of the ancient scribal transmission centuries before the printing press was invented. The English translators, trying to faithfully render a broken sentence, smoothed it into Saul reigned 1 year. And when he had reigned 2 years, I hold this is the reality of scribal transmission, the physical history of the parchment, not a failure of the divine text. But this missing number changes everything about the smoke rising at Gilgal. If we cross-reference this moment with the New Testament, the Apostle Paul stands up in Acts chapter 13 and declares that God gave Israel a king, Saul the son of Cis, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, by the space of 40 years. 40 years. Jewish tradition echoes this extended reign. Now add one more detail from the very next verse in 1 Samuel. Verse 2 tells us that Saul chose 3,000 men, and 1,000 of them were stationed with Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's son. A son who is fully grown, hardened, and commanding a third of the national military. You do not have a battle-hardened, garrison-commanding son in the 2nd year of your reign if you were anointed as a young man. The timeline has suddenly stretched. Picture it. The man standing beside the smoldering altar at Gilgal, watching his armies scatter into the rocks, is not a green, panicked boy. He is a veteran warlord. Decades have passed since the oil was poured on his head. He has built a life, a family, a military infrastructure. The pressure crushing his chest that morning is not the panic of a novice. It is the terror of a seasoned king who realizes an old, dormant trap has finally snapped shut. The 7-day deadline that just expired did not begin a week ago. Samuel did not send a messenger the previous Tuesday telling Saul to wait. The clock that ran out at Gilgal was wound years earlier, buried so deep in Saul's past, he might have hoped heaven had forgotten it. Where did the 7-day countdown actually come from? Oil runs down the forehead of a young Benjamite, catching the dust of the road. The prophet Samuel has just shattered a vial over Saul's head, declaring him captain over the inheritance of the Lord. It is the beginning of everything. Samuel does not just give him a crown, he gives him a precise, chronological map of the immediate future. You will meet 2 men by Rachel's tomb. You will meet 3 men carrying goats and bread near Bethel. You will meet a company of prophets coming down from a high place with instruments, and the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you. All of these signs happen perfectly. They happen immediately. Within hours, the young king watches the prophet's words materialize in the physical world. But right after listing those rapid-fire signs, the old prophet drops a heavy, unexploded piece of ordnance into the timeline. 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 8. Listen to the King James verbatim. "And thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down unto thee to offer burnt offerings, and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry, till I come to thee, and shew thee what thou shalt do." Stop right there. Look at the architecture of the book. This order is handed down in chapter 10. The ashes rise from the altar in chapter 13. If the fractured parchment in the Qumran caves is correct, and decades have passed between his anointing and this crisis, then this command has been sitting in the dark for a lifetime. Picture it, a dormant trap, a landmine, planted at the exact moment of his coronation. Saul carried this 7-day countdown through his early, staggering military victories. He carried it while he built his royal guard. He carried it while his son Jonathan grew from a boy into a hardened garrison commander. Go down to Gilgal. Wait 7 days. Do not offer the sacrifice until I arrive. I hold this as the ancient Jewish timeline, a record of decades, not days. And if you read it this way, the terror at Gilgal takes on an entirely different weight. When Jonathan assassinates the Philistine governor at Geba in chapter 13, triggering a massive, apocalyptic retaliation from the enemy, Saul sounds the trumpet. He retreats to the staging ground in the Jordan Valley, Gilgal. And the moment his boots hit the dust of that specific camp, the ancient clock wakes up. The 7-day countdown, handed to him when he was a green, newly anointed king, suddenly begins to tick. Day 1, day 2, day 3, but Samuel does not come. See the scene. The prophet told him, years ago, I will come down unto thee, and shew thee what thou shalt do. But as the week bleeds out, Saul realizes the man of God is deliberately pushing him to the absolute brink of destruction. The delay is not an accident. It is an engineered psychological crucible, and the environment Samuel chose for this test makes the waiting almost impossible. Because while Saul is pacing around the unlit altar at Gilgal, staring at the sky, his men are realizing the horrifying reality of their physical disadvantage. They are not just outnumbered. They have been systematically, surgically stripped of the ability to defend themselves. The geographical trap at Gilgal is closing. But to understand why the Israelites are weeping and fleeing into the limestone caves before the battle even begins, we have to look at the iron chokehold the Philistines have placed on the mountains above them. The limestone fractures of the Judean wilderness are completely silent, except for the sound of breathing. Grown men, veterans of Saul's earlier campaigns, are wedging themselves into dark, narrow fissures in the rock. They are throwing themselves into dry cisterns. They are crawling under dense thorn bushes, burying their faces in the dirt to avoid being seen from the ridge above. Listen to 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 6. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves, and in thickets, and in rocks, and in high places, and in pits. Read that again. This is not a tactical retreat. This is a total psychological collapse. The army of the living God is dissolving into the earth like water. To understand why a hardened military force would suddenly snap and hide like hunted animals, look at the geography. Saul is trapped in Gilgal, down in the flat, open expanse of the Jordan Valley. Directly above him, perched in the central highlands at Michmash, is the Philistine war machine. The elevation drop is massive. The enemy is literally looking down the throats of the Israelites. But altitude is not the true terror. The real horror of this week is hidden 13 verses later in a detail that explains why Saul's men realize they are walking into a slaughter. 1 Samuel 13, verse 19. Now there was no smith found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. The Philistines did not just conquer territory, they monopolized the iron trade. They systematically dismantled every blacksmith forge in Israel. For years, if an Israelite wanted to sharpen a plowshare or an axe, he had to walk into a Philistine garrison and pay an exorbitant fee. Watch what the text does in verse 22. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan. But with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found 2 swords for the entire standing army, complete, undisputed technological dominance. Picture it. 30,000 enemy chariots of iron are massing on the high ground, 6,000 armored cavalry. And down in the valley, Saul's men are holding sharpened sticks, agricultural hoes, and wooden clubs. It is not a battle line, it is a firing squad. And as the 7-day clock ticks down, the reality of this mismatch begins to break the minds of the men in the camp. There is an ancient reading of this text that captures the exact pitch of their terror. Targum Jonathan, the ancient Aramaic paraphrase of the Hebrew prophets read aloud in the synagogues, does not just translate the word distressed in verse 6. The Targum expands the Aramaic to say the people were broken in spirit. The original Hebrew word used in the canonical text is niggaz, which means to be driven by a taskmaster, tyrannized, squeezed until the breath leaves the body. I offer it as that, one tradition's record of the atmospheric pressure. The terror was not just fear of death. It was the suffocating, paralyzing realization of absolute helplessness. This is what Saul is watching. He is standing beside an unlit altar at Gilgal, looking at the thousands of men who swore allegiance to him. Every time he blinks, another 100 vanish into the rocks. He is bleeding manpower by the hour. The men who stay are trembling violently. And Samuel, the man who holds the supernatural authority to start the battle, the man who set this precise deadline years ago, is nowhere to be seen. The sun goes down on the 6th day. The dark settles over the valley. When the light breaks, on the 7th morning, the king will finally hit his absolute limit. He will look at the fraction of his army that remains, and he will speak one specific Hebrew word to justify reaching for the fire himself. The sun crests the jagged peaks of the Moabite mountains to the east, spilling terrible light into the Jordan Valley. It is the morning of the 7th day, the deadline. Saul stands in the camp at Gilgal and takes a final census of the men who have not fled into the dark. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15, holds the devastating math of this morning. Later in the chapter, after the smoke clears, the text reveals exactly what the week of waiting cost him. And Saul numbered the people that were present with him, about 600 men. 600. Stop right there. He started this campaign with 3,000 hand-picked veterans. He has lost 80% of his military force to sheer psychological terror. 2,400 men have buried themselves in pits and caves rather than face the Philistine war machine. And the 600 who remain are shivering in the valley, holding wooden farm tools against an empire of iron. The sun climbs higher. The morning passes. Samuel does not come. The pressure in the camp reaches a threshold that human biology is not designed to withstand. The men are looking at the king. The king is looking at the eastern road. The road is completely empty. And high above them, at Michmash, the Philistine vanguard is beginning to stir. The enemy is preparing to march. Saul realizes that if he waits one more hour, he will not have an army left to lead. The last 600 men will break. So he makes the fatal calculation. 1 Samuel 13, verse 9. And Saul said, "Bring hither a burnt offering to me, and peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. Watch what the text does. Saul does not just order the fire lit. The phrasing implies a usurpation. The king takes the authority of the altar into his own hands. He steps over the invisible, terrifying boundary between the crown and the priesthood. Picture it. He slaughters the animal. He places the carcass on the stone. He brings the fire. He is trying to bind his disintegrating army together with the gravity of a divine ritual. It is a desperately pragmatic move by a military commander who has run out of options. I offer it as that, a window into the absolute terror of a man caught between the physical world and a spiritual command. But the timing of what happens next is almost sickening. Verse 10. And it came to pass that as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. Read that again. As soon as he had made an end, the fire is barely catching the fat. The blood is still wet on the stones. The smoke has just begun to rise into the heavy valley air, and the old prophet crests the ridge. He is not a day late. He is not even a few hours late. He arrives at the exact, microscopic moment the boundary is breached. The timing is too perfect. It is the arrival of a man who knows exactly when the trap was designed to snap. Saul walks out to meet him, smelling of smoke and blood, trying to play the part of the faithful king. He offers a standard royal greeting, but Samuel does not greet him back. Samuel looks at the smoldering altar, looks at the trembling king, and demands to know what he has done. And in his defense, Saul uses a single Hebrew verb that exposes the absolute bedrock of his panic. Two men standing in the ashes of a premature sacrifice, surrounded by a phantom army. The king is about to speak, and the word he chooses will seal the fate of his bloodline forever. What exactly did Saul say to justify his breaking of the boundary? The smoke of the burnt offering drifts between the king and the prophet. Gilgal is completely still. The 600 remaining soldiers watch from the dust, trembling, as the man with the crown and the man with the mantle stand face to face beside the bleeding carcass. Listen to 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 11. And Samuel said, "What hast thou done?" Saul does not apologize. He delivers a brutally logical, mathematically precise defense of his actions. He points to the 3 walls of the trap that just crushed him. "Because I saw that the people were scattered from me," Saul says, "and that thou camest not within the days appointed, and that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash." Picture it. The disappearing army, the expired clock, the iron empire on the high ground. Then Saul speaks the sentence that locks his fate forever. Verse 12, "Therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication unto the Lord. I forced myself therefore, and offered a burnt offering." Stop right there. Look closely at that phrase. "I forced myself therefore." Turn the English back into the ancient Hebrew it was translated from. The verb here is aphaq. It is a dark, muscular word. It means to restrain oneself, to hold back by violent physical or emotional force. In the specific grammatical form Saul uses, it describes an agonizing internal rupture. It means to overcome your own violent resistance, to compel yourself to do the unthinkable. Read that again. Saul is telling the prophet, "I did not want to do this." We are often handed a version of this story where Saul is simply an arrogant, impatient king trying to play priest, a man who thinks he is above the law and grabs for spiritual power. But the Hebrew word aphaq shatters that clean, easy narrative. The ancient text reveals that Saul knew exactly where the boundary was. He knew the altar did not belong to him. He felt the terrifying, electric weight of stepping into a priesthood he did not hold. He resisted it until his mind fractured. He held back until the men were gone. The time was up, and the chariots were preparing to roll over his camp. He did not stroll to the altar in pride. He dragged himself to the fire in absolute, suffocating panic. Sit with that. Saul believed the physical ritual of the sacrifice was the only thing standing between his men. And a total massacre. He believed God needed the smoke more than God required the obedience. He thought the mechanics of the religion could save him if he just sparked the fire in time. I hold this as the tragic autopsy of a king breaking under pressure, a window into his terror, not an excuse for his violation. Watch what the text does. Saul has just laid out a defense that makes perfect human sense. Militarily, it is flawless. Psychologically, it is devastating. Any earthly general, looking at the thousands of deserters, the unyielding enemy, and the prophet's own baffling delay, would acquit the king on the spot. Saul looks at Samuel, waiting for the old man to acknowledge the impossible crucible he was placed in. He has laid his entire bleeding heart on the stones of Gilgal. He has explained the violent internal force it took to break the command. How will the man who speaks for heaven respond to a king who snapped inside a perfectly engineered trap? The smoke of the burning animal hangs heavy in the Jordan Valley, catching in the throats of the terrified men. Saul has just poured out his defense. The disappearing army, the Iron Empire on the ridge, the expired clock, the agonizing internal violence of forcing himself to light the fire. He stands before the old prophet, waiting for an acknowledgement of the impossible crucible. Samuel stares back at him. He is completely unmoved. Listen to the verdict handed down in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, "Thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever." Read that again. The prophet completely bypasses the military reality. Samuel does not care about the 30,000 chariots. He does not care that the Israelites are hiding in limestone pits. He does not care that the king was bleeding manpower by the hour. All of the brutal, perfectly logical, earthly math that broke Saul's mind is entirely irrelevant to the man who speaks for heaven. There is an ancient historical record that captures the absolute, terrifying coldness of this moment. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Romano-Jewish historian, records this exact confrontation in his masterwork, Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus writes that when Saul offered his desperate, mathematically precise defense, Samuel cut him off with absolute severity. According to this ancient record, the prophet offered zero empathy for the king's panic. He told Saul that a true king would have waited in the silence, confident that the divine timeline is not threatened by the movement of an enemy army. I offer it as that, one tradition's record of the unforgiving nature of the confrontation. Then Samuel delivers the fatal blow. 1 Samuel 13, verse 14. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be captain over his people, because thou hast not kept that which the Lord commanded thee. The dynasty is dead. Watch what the text does. The penalty is not immediate death. The penalty is not even immediate removal from the throne. Saul will reign for decades. He will win battles. He will build fortresses. But the bloodline has just been permanently severed. The weight of this sentence falls directly on the shoulders of the king's son, Jonathan, the brilliant, battle-hardened prince, who is currently holding a useless wooden spear against the Philistine vanguard, will never wear the crown. Because his father panicked in the valley, the kingdom will be torn from his family and handed to a shepherd boy who is not yet born. The punishment feels devastatingly disproportionate to the modern mind. A delayed prophet, a rushed sacrifice, an aborted dynasty. But sit with the reality of what just happened at the altar. Saul did not just light a fire. He believed the mechanics of the religion were a machine he could operate to force a military outcome. He thought the priesthood was a tactical weapon, a button he could push when his back was against the wall. He treated the divine boundary as something negotiable under extreme pressure. And heaven responds with absolute, uncompromising rejection. 1 Samuel 13, verse 15. And Samuel arose and gat him up from Gilgal unto Gibeah of Benjamin. Picture it. The prophet does not stay to help. He does not pray for the men. He turns his back on the smoldering altar, turns his back on the shivering king, and walks away up the road. Saul is left standing in the ashes, staring at the 600 men who remain, with the Philistine war machine preparing to descend. The crown and the priesthood have collided, and the king has lost everything that mattered. But when you look closely at the fire still burning on the stone, the deepest mystery of this chapter finally reveals itself. When the prophet vanishes up the road, leaving a doomed king alone with a slaughtered animal, what exactly burned away in the ashes of Gilgal? Go back to the valley of Gilgal. The air is still thick with the copper scent of blood. The heavy, black smoke of the burnt offering is still rising into the Judean sky. A king is standing beside the stone altar, but he is no longer watching the eastern horizon for a prophet. He is watching the prophet walk away. You have read this scene before. A delayed arrival, a hasty sacrifice, a lost crown. But when you look at the smoke now, you are not looking at a rookie mistake by an impatient young man. Picture it. You are looking at the ashes of an ancient, dormant trap. You are looking at a veteran warlord who stared into the teeth of an iron empire, watched 80% of his army melt into the limestone caves out of sheer, suffocating terror, and finally broke his own mind to cross a boundary he knew he was never meant to cross. The clock that expired that morning was wound decades prior. The fire on the stone was never really about burning an animal. It was the ultimate, catastrophic collision between the crown and the priesthood. Sit with that. Saul believed the mechanics of the religion could save him. He thought if he just lit the fire, the ritual itself would serve as a tactical shield against the 30,000 chariots massing at Michmash. He forced himself aphaq to operate the machinery of the altar because his earthly logic demanded a physical solution. He treated the divine boundary as a glass to be broken in case of military emergency, and heaven answered by severing his bloodline forever. I offer this as one reading of the ancient texts, not the final word. Test it the way the Bereans tested everything. But the shattered parchment in the caves of Qumran and the Aramaic memory of the synagogue force us to see the terrifying, suffocating weight of that morning. Reading, not inventing. Yet, as Samuel vanishes up the dusty road to Gibeah, something dark remains unresolved in the ashes. The prophet declared that the Lord had already sought a man after his own heart. The dynasty is dead, but the physical reality on the ground has not changed. The Philistine chariots are still gathered on the high ridge. The thousands of iron weapons are still aimed at 600 trembling men holding wooden clubs. Saul is still wearing the physical crown. He is now a walking ghost in his own kingdom, condemned to lead a war he has already spiritually lost, waiting for a replacement king who has not yet arrived. The text leaves us in the brutal, agonizing space between the sentence of heaven and the execution on earth. The desert is still holding the rest. If this journey through the ghost timeline of Israel's first king shifted how you read this chapter, comment the word "watched" below so I know you made it to the end. Subscribe to the channel, because we are going back into the caves of Qumran next week to unroll another text the Western world left behind. And send this to one person who loves the Old Testament but has never heard the true terror of what happened at Gilgal. Sometimes the hardest command heaven gives is not to draw a sword, but to stand in the terrifying dark and wait for the clock to bleed out.